Welcome to my kitchen. I'm Claire, I'm 93 years old, and today we are making meals from the Depression.
Cheese, bacon, everything delicious in the world. I hope you get a chance to make this because the smell and the taste are beyond the beyond.
This is seriously the best beef stroganoff, and it comes together so easy. The beef is so tender, the sauce is seasoned to perfection, and I love the thick sliced mushrooms. They're just as meaty as the beef. This is such a treat.
There was a time when every tired man came home to a hot plate that told a story of making do with what you had. Back in the 1980s, cookbooks weren't filled with fancy ingredients or complicated techniques. These were meals born from necessity, crafted in kitchens where every dollar mattered and every plate had to be full. Beef stroganoff. Beef stroganoff wasn't restaurant food back then. It was Thursday night when the paycheck was running thin, but everyone still needed to feel like dinner mattered. You'd hear Mom in the kitchen, that familiar sizzle of chuck roast hitting hot margarine, and you knew tonight was going to be different. The smell would creep through the house, rich, meaty, promising, while she stirred those strips of beef with wooden spoons that had seen 1,000 similar dinners. The onions came next, softening in the same pan until they were golden and sweet, filling the kitchen with the kind of aroma that made homework stop and stomachs start paying attention. Then the mushrooms, not because they were fancy, but because they stretched expensive beef into something that could feed 6 people without anyone leaving the table hungry. Those canned mushrooms turned 1 pound of meat into enough dinner for the whole family, and nobody questioned the math, but it was the sour cream that made everything feel luxurious. Stirred in at the very end, off the heat so it wouldn't curdle, transforming all those separate ingredients into something creamy and rich that coated every grain of those wide egg noodles. The noodles cost pennies, but they did their job, soaking up every bit of that sauce like they understood their purpose in making this meal feel complete. Dad would come home with grease under his fingernails and sawdust in his hair, see the stroganoff bubbling on the stove, and his shoulders would drop an inch. Someone had put in real effort tonight, even when money was tight and easier options were calling. Kids would clean their plates without being asked, and there were always enough leftovers for lunch tomorrow, which somehow tasted even better after all those flavors had spent the night getting acquainted in the refrigerator. This wasn't about impressing anyone. This was about taking a tough day and ending it with something that tasted like caring, served over noodles that understood their job was to make everyone feel full and satisfied, no matter what the bank account looked like. Tater Tot Hot Dish. In Minnesota, kitchens, and throughout the Midwest, Tater Tot Hot Dish was more than dinner. It was a way of life that understood how to feed a family when every dollar mattered. The sound of that oven door opening after 45 minutes could stop conversations and bring kids running from wherever they'd been hiding. Golden tots on top, bubbling cream sauce underneath, and the promise that tonight nobody would go to bed hungry. The bottom layer was always ground beef, browned until it actually looked brown, instead of that sad gray that happened when you rushed things. Smart cooks seasoned it right in the pan. Salt, pepper, maybe some garlic powder if the budget allowed for extras. The beef mixed with diced onions that had been cooked until they were soft and sweet, creating a foundation that would carry the whole dish through that long bake in the oven. Then came whatever vegetables were on sale or hiding in the back of the freezer. Green beans, corn, mixed vegetables. It didn't matter as long as they added color and helped stretch that pound of ground beef into enough dinner for everyone. The cream of mushroom soup went on next, spread like a blanket over everything, thick and rich and promising to bind all those separate ingredients into something that felt like a real meal. But those tater tots on top, perfectly arranged in rows like little golden soldiers, that's what made it special. Kids would fight over who got the corner pieces where the tots got extra crispy, and adults would find themselves scraping the edges of the casserole dish to get every last bit of that creamy sauce that had bubbled up around the edges. This was church potluck food that worked just as well for Tuesday night dinner. It was Minnesota nice in casserole form, the kind of meal that said, "We take care of each other here, we don't waste anything, and we make sure everyone gets enough." One dish fed the whole family with enough left over for tomorrow's lunch, proving that the best comfort food didn't need fancy ingredients, just the understanding that food was love made visible. Chicken divan. Chicken divan had a way of making yesterday's leftover rotisserie chicken feel like Sunday dinner all over again. The smell of broccoli steaming on the stove, mixed with the sound of that store-bought chicken being pulled apart by hand, creating something that felt like real cooking, even when you were mostly just assembling ingredients that someone else had already prepared. The broccoli had to be just right. Bright green and tender, but not mushy, because it was going to spend time in the oven and you didn't want it falling apart. Smart cooks learned to pull it off the heat while it still had some bite, knowing it would finish cooking under that blanket of cheese and sauce. Into the buttered casserole dish it went, a green foundation that would add color and nutrition to what might otherwise have been just chicken and cheese. The chicken came next, torn into chunks that looked intentional rather than like leftovers you were trying to use up. Rotisserie chicken was perfect for this. Already seasoned, already tender, and available at the grocery store for less than you could cook a whole chicken yourself. It didn't matter that you hadn't roasted it in your own oven. What mattered was turning it into something that felt like a planned meal rather than just reheated leftovers. But the sauce was what made everything special. Cream of chicken soup mixed with milk and sour cream, seasoned with just enough salt and pepper to wake up those flavors, then enriched with a generous handful of sharp cheddar cheese. Poured over the chicken and broccoli, it promised to bind everything together into something cohesive and satisfying. The buttery breadcrumbs on top, or crushed Ritz crackers if you were feeling fancy, turned golden brown in the oven while everything underneath heated through and those flavors melded together. 20 minutes later, you had something that looked like you'd been cooking all day, served straight from the casserole dish onto plates that always got scraped clean, with everyone asking if there was enough left for seconds. Hamburger helper beef stroganoff. That little white glove on the box was like a friendly hand reaching out to exhausted parents everywhere. Hamburger helper changed weeknight cooking forever, and the beef stroganoff flavor was the one that made working mothers everywhere breathe a sigh of relief. Brown a pound of ground beef, dump in the contents of that box, add some milk and water, and 15 minutes later you had something that resembled real stroganoff without any of the fuss. The sound of ground beef hitting the hot pan was immediately recognizable, that aggressive sizzle that meant dinner was happening fast tonight. Kids would start gravitating toward the kitchen, homework forgotten, because they knew the drill. The seasoning packet would come next, along with those flat pasta pieces that looked almost like the real egg noodles from fancy Stroganoff, but cooked much faster and held up better to the vigorous stirring that one-pot meals required. The milk made everything creamy, the water provided the liquid needed to cook the pasta, and somehow that little packet of powdered seasonings contained enough flavor magic to make everything taste like someone had been stirring and seasoning for hours. It wasn't the same as homemade stroganoff with real sour cream and fresh mushrooms, but after a 10-hour shift and homework battles, it was close enough. The smell was distinctive. That combination of browning meat and the unique aroma of the seasoning mix that promised comfort and satisfaction were coming soon. You could smell it from the driveway, which meant dinner would be ready by the time everyone washed their hands and found their places around the table. The pasta absorbed all those flavors as it cooked, becoming more than just a vehicle for sauce, turning into something that actually tasted like stroganoff if you didn't think too hard about how it got that way. Was it gourmet? Not even close. Did it fill bellies and keep families fed on countless weeknight dinners when cooking felt impossible? Absolutely. And sometimes, when you were really tired and really hungry, it actually tasted better than the homemade version because it meant someone cared enough to get dinner on the table without making a big production out of it. Porcupine Meatballs. Porcupine meatballs were born from the kind of kitchen wisdom that understood how to make a pound of ground beef feed 6 people and still feel like you were serving something special. The name alone was enough to make kids giggle and forget they were eating a meal designed to stretch expensive protein with cheap rice. When those meatballs simmered in tomato sauce, the rice grains poked out like little spikes, giving them their funny name that somehow made dinner feel more fun. The mixing happened in a big bowl, ground beef combined with uncooked rice and diced onions, everything held together with a beaten egg and seasoned with whatever was handy: salt, pepper, maybe some garlic powder if the spice rack was well stocked. The rice wasn't just filler. It was insurance against tough meatballs, absorbing moisture and helping everything stay tender during the long, slow cooking that would transform tough into delicious. You could feel the grains of rice when you rolled the meatballs between your palms, knowing they were going to expand and soften during cooking, creating those characteristic spikes that gave the dish its whimsical name. Into the simmering tomato sauce they went, sometimes just canned tomato soup thinned with water, sometimes actual tomato sauce if the budget allowed for extras, but always something acidic and rich that would help break down the meat while building flavor. The kitchen filled with the smell of slow-simmering comfort, tomatoes and beef and onions all melding together over low heat that couldn't be rushed. The longer they cooked, the more tender they became, and the more the rice absorbed all those savory flavors from the sauce. By dinner time, you had meatballs that were tender enough to cut with a fork, and rice that tasted like it had been planning this flavor combination all along. Served over mashed potatoes or egg noodles, they were comfort food that understood exactly how far a dollar needed to stretch. The sauce was always the best part, rich with the flavors from the meatballs and perfect for soaking up with whatever starch was brave enough to share the plate. Leftovers were even better the next day, making lunch something to look forward to rather than just another reheated meal. Salmon patties with creamed peas. Friday nights often meant salmon patties, not because fish was fancy, but because a can of salmon cost less than $2 and could feed a family of 4. You'd hear the can opener working, that distinctive sound that meant Mom was making something different tonight, something that would turn a humble can of pink fish into golden brown patties that somehow felt more special than they had any right to. The salmon got drained and picked through carefully, looking for any sneaky bones that might have made it through the canning process. Then came the mixing, breadcrumbs that might have been store-bought or might have been made from the heels of the bread loaf, a beaten egg to hold everything together, and diced onions for flavor and texture. Some families added saltine crackers instead of breadcrumbs, which gave a slightly different texture and a hint of salt that made everything taste more intentional. The hot oil in the cast-iron skillet was crucial. It had to be just the right temperature to create that immediate sizzle when the patties hit the pan, promising a crispy exterior that would contrast with the tender, flaky interior. You could hear them cooking, that gentle bubbling that meant the coating was getting golden brown while the salmon heated through and all those flavors melded together. The creamed peas were the perfect companion, made by cooking frozen peas in a simple white sauce that was basically just butter, flour, and milk cooked together until smooth and rich. The mild sweetness of the peas balanced the salty richness of the salmon, and together they created something that felt both humble and slightly elegant, like company food made with everyday ingredients. Kids might pick at the peas, but they'd devour those golden brown patties, especially if you served them with a squeeze of lemon juice or a dollop of tartar sauce if the budget stretched that far. Any leftovers made excellent breakfast the next morning, fried up crispy, and served alongside scrambled eggs, proving that good food could work for any meal of the day. The whole meal cost less than what a single serving of fish would run at a restaurant, but it filled everyone up and left them feeling like they'd eaten something real and satisfying, which was all that mattered when the paycheck had to stretch until next Friday. Chili Mac. Chili Mac was what happened when the chili pot was running low, but there were still mouths to feed and no money for takeout. Someone, somewhere, had the genius idea to boil up some elbow macaroni and let the thick, meaty chili stretch itself over those little tubes of pasta, turning not quite enough into plenty. The smell that rose from those bowls, rich chili mingling with starchy pasta, was pure comfort born from making do. This wasn't really a recipe as much as it was a solution to the eternal problem of having almost enough of something, but not quite. Sunday's big pot of chili was supposed to last several meals, but families have a way of eating more than you expect, and by Wednesday you might find yourself staring at just enough chili for 3 people when 5 needed dinner. The pasta transformed everything. Those elbow macaroni soaked up the chili flavors, cumin and tomatoes and whatever heat had made it into the original pot, while adding the bulk that turned a small amount of chili into a filling meal. The starch helped mellow any spiciness that might be too intense for kids, while making everything stick to your ribs in the way that only carbohydrates could manage. Sharp cheddar cheese melted on top while everything was still steaming hot, creating this gooey, irresistible mess that nobody could resist. Kids would get chili sauce on their shirts and not care. Dad would go back for seconds with a cold beer, and Mom would feel like she'd pulled off some kind of kitchen magic trick that turned scarcity into abundance. The leftovers were always better than the original because all those flavors had time to get acquainted overnight, melding together into something that tasted like it had been planned all along, rather than thrown together from whatever was available. Reheated the next day with a little extra cheese on top, it became a completely different dish that was somehow exactly what everyone wanted to eat again. Chicken a la king over biscuits. Chicken a la king was how you turned yesterday's leftover chicken into something that felt like a special occasion. The sound of butter melting in the pan, followed by the gentle whisking of flour into that golden fat, promised that something creamy and rich was coming together. This was restaurant-quality comfort food made with whatever chicken was left from Sunday's dinner, transformed into something that looked like you'd been planning this meal all week. The white sauce was where technique mattered, but it was technique that any working mother could master with practice. Butter, flour, and milk cooked together until smooth and thick, with just enough seasoning to wake up those flavors without overwhelming the mild chicken. The key was patience. Rushing the sauce meant lumps, and nobody wanted lumpy gravy on their biscuits when they were trying to make leftovers feel elegant. The chicken went in next, diced into bite-sized pieces that would distribute evenly through the creamy sauce. Leftover roasted chicken was perfect for this, already seasoned and tender, just needing to be warmed through rather than cooked again. Frozen peas added color and a little sweetness, while diced carrots provided crunch and nutrition that made the whole plate look intentional and balanced. Split biscuits made the perfect base, fluffy, buttery platforms that could soak up that rich sauce without falling apart. Whether they were from scratch or from a can didn't matter. What mattered was having something substantial enough to make this feel like a complete meal rather than just creamy chicken soup served in a bowl. The finished dish looked like something you might order at a nice restaurant, but it cost a fraction of what eating out would run and used up ingredients that might otherwise have become just another sandwich. Served hot from the stove, with that creamy sauce pooling around the edges of the biscuits, it proved that the best comfort food came from understanding how to make something special from whatever you already had. Beef and noodle casserole. Beef and noodle casserole was the answer when you needed to feed everyone, but weren't sure exactly how you were going to make it happen. Ground beef, egg noodles, whatever vegetables were hiding in the freezer, and a can of cream soup to bind it all together, assembled in one dish and baked until everything melded into something greater than the sum of its parts. The smell that came from the oven during that final 20 minutes was pure reassurance that dinner was handled. The beauty was in how forgiving it was. Didn't have cream of mushroom soup? Cream of chicken worked fine. No ground beef? Ground turkey was cheaper and nobody complained. The vegetables could be anything. Frozen mixed vegetables, leftover green beans from last night, even canned corn drained and stirred in for sweetness and color. The noodles absorbed all those flavors while they baked, becoming more than just a starch filler. You could hear the casserole bubbling in the oven during those last few minutes, the cheese on top getting golden and slightly crispy, while everything underneath heated through and those flavors melded together. Kids loved how everything came together in one dish. No separate vegetables to negotiate, no sides to finish before getting dessert. It was all mixed up together, covered in melted cheese, and served hot from the oven. The ground beef layer was where smart cooks added flavor beyond just salt and pepper. A packet of onion soup mix could transform plain ground beef into something with real depth, while proper browning created the kind of rich, caramelized flavors that made the whole dish taste more expensive than it actually was. Gray, steamed ground beef never contributed much to any meal, but properly browned meat with good color added richness to everything it touched. Leftovers reheated beautifully, often tasting even better the next day after all those flavors had time to get properly acquainted. One casserole dish fed the whole family, with enough left over for lunch tomorrow, proving that the best weeknight meals were the ones that understood how to stretch ingredients and effort across multiple meals. Sloppy Joes. Sloppy Joes answered the eternal weeknight question of how to make 1 pound of ground beef feed everyone without anyone leaving the table unsatisfied. The sound of that meat hitting the hot pan, followed by the sweet smell of brown sugar and ketchup simmering together, promised that tonight was going to be messy and delicious and completely unpretentious. The name was honest. These were definitely sloppy, and that was exactly the point. Brown that meat with some diced onions until everything was properly caramelized and smelling like dinner, then add ketchup for sweetness, brown sugar for depth, and Worcestershire sauce for that umami complexity that made everything taste more grown up. The mixture needed to simmer until it was thick enough to pile on hamburger buns without running off the sides, but not so thick that it felt like eating meatloaf filling. The beauty was in how simple it was. Most of the ingredients were pantry staples that you could keep on hand for exactly these kinds of weeknight emergencies when cooking felt impossible, but everyone still needed to eat something substantial. The whole meal could be on the table in 20 minutes, which made it perfect for those nights when homework and bedtime were competing with empty stomachs. Kids who normally turned their noses up at regular hamburgers would devour Sloppy Joes, probably because the sweet tangy sauce made everything taste like a treat rather than just another dinner. The messiness was part of the appeal. Everyone needed extra napkins, everyone got sauce on their fingers, and somehow that made dinner feel more relaxed after a day of trying to keep everything neat and proper. The smell alone could bring everyone to the dinner table. That combination of browning beef, sweet ketchup, and tangy Worcestershire created an aroma that said comfort food was happening. No fancy ingredients required. Served on soft hamburger buns with potato chips and maybe some pickles on the side, it was a meal that satisfied without pretending to be anything more sophisticated than it was. Liver and onions. Liver and onions was not about pleasure. It was about nutrition and economy working together in the practical way that defined so much of working-class cooking. The smell hit you the moment you walked in the house, thick, unmistakable, filling every corner with an aroma that made kids start negotiating before they even sat down. This was dinner that reminded you that food was medicine first, comfort second. The preparation was straightforward, but required understanding. The liver got sliced thin and soaked in milk to draw out some of that strong mineral flavor that made it so polarizing. Then it was dusted with seasoned flour and fried quickly in hot fat, bacon grease if you had it. vegetable oil if you didn't. The key was not overcooking it, which would make it tough and even stronger in flavor than it already was. But those onions, sliced thick and cooked slow until they were golden brown and caramelized, that's what made the whole thing bearable. They provided the sweetness that balanced the intensity of the liver, cooking in the same pan to pick up all those flavors while contributing their own gentle, mellowing influence. Smart cooks knew that those onions were the bridge between nutrition and palatability. This came from a generation that had lived through the Depression and understood that you didn't waste any part of an animal. Liver was loaded with iron and B vitamins, cost less than any other protein at the butcher shop, and whether you liked it or not was beside the point. It was good for you, especially for kids who needed iron for growing bodies and parents who needed strength for hard work. Dads who grew up during lean times remembered when liver was a luxury, something you were grateful to have on your plate. Kids in the 1980s saw it as punishment, but they ate it because you didn't get dessert otherwise, and those sweet caramelized onions actually made it taste pretty good if you didn't think too hard about what you were chewing. Served with mashed potatoes to soak up the pan juices, it was a meal that taught you that life wasn't always sweet, but it was always worth pushing through. Tuna Noodle Casserole. When the pantry was looking sparse and payday was still 3 days away, tuna noodle casserole was the dish that could rescue any weeknight. The sound of that can opener working on 2 cans of tuna, followed by the familiar routine of boiling egg noodles and heating up cream of mushroom soup, promised that dinner was happening even when it felt like there wasn't much to work with. This was comfort food built on ingredients that could sit in your pantry indefinitely until you needed them. Canned tuna kept forever, egg noodles were cheap and filling, cream soup provided richness without requiring any sauce-making skills, and frozen peas added color and nutrition without much expense. The whole thing could be assembled in one dish and baked until bubbly, transforming simple ingredients into something that actually felt like a planned meal. The key was in the proportions. Enough soup to make everything creamy without being soupy, enough tuna to feel substantial without overwhelming the mild flavors, and enough noodles to soak up all those flavors while providing the carbohydrates that made the meal filling. The peas could go in frozen. They'd cook through in the oven without becoming mushy or losing their bright green color. But that topping, crushed potato chips or buttered breadcrumbs, was what transformed simple casserole into something special. The chips provided salty crunch that contrasted with the creamy interior, while breadcrumbs gave a more sophisticated finish that made the whole dish look intentional rather than thrown together. Either way, that golden, crispy layer on top made all the difference. The smell that came from the oven during those last few minutes of baking was pure reassurance. Bubbling cream sauce and toasted breadcrumbs, promising that even when the refrigerator was nearly empty, you could still put something satisfying on the table that would leave everyone feeling fed and cared for. Hamburger rice skillet. 1 pound of ground beef, 1 cup of rice, and whatever else you could find in the pantry. This was dinner that happened entirely in a single skillet when washing dishes felt like the last straw after a long day. The sound of beef hitting hot oil, followed by the gentle sizzle of rice toasting in those savory drippings, promised something filling and comforting without a sink full of dirty pots to deal with afterward. The technique was borrowed from fancier cooking, toasting the rice in fat before adding liquid, but adapted for the reality of weeknight dinners when technique had to serve efficiency. Every grain got coated with those beef drippings, which meant every bite would taste like more than just plain rice. The onions softened in the same pan, adding sweetness and depth that made the whole dish taste more complex than its simple ingredient list suggested. Canned tomatoes provided both flavor and some of the liquid needed to cook the rice, while beef broth, or even just bouillon dissolved in water, added richness that made everything taste more intentional. The key was getting the ratio right. Too much liquid, and you'd end up with soup. Too little, and the rice would be crunchy and undercooked. But get it right, and you had something that satisfied both hunger and the need for comfort. Smart cooks added frozen vegetables in the last few minutes. Corn, peas, green beans, whatever was hiding in the freezer. This turned simple rice and beef into something that looked and tasted like a complete meal, with colors that made parents feel good about what they were serving, and flavors that made kids clean their plates without being asked. The whole thing cooked in 20 minutes, start to finish, in one pan that could go from stovetop to table without any fuss. It was efficiency and flavor working together to create something that understood exactly what busy families needed. Food that was filling, satisfying, and didn't create more work than it solved. Stuffed bell peppers. Stuffed bell peppers made individual dinner presentations out of everyday ingredients, turning ground beef and rice into something that looked like you'd put in way more effort than you actually had. The peppers stood up straight in the baking dish like little green soldiers, each one a personal casserole that made everyone feel special, even when dinner was basically just leftovers dressed up in vegetable costumes. The preparation felt almost ceremonial, cutting the tops off those peppers, scooping out all the seeds and white membrane, creating hollow vessels that would hold whatever mixture you'd managed to put together. Ground beef mixed with cooked rice, diced onions for flavor, and whatever seasonings were handy, all bound together with a beaten egg that would help everything hold its shape during baking. The peppers themselves added vegetables to the meal without any negotiation from picky eaters. They were essentially edible serving bowls, softening in the oven until they were tender but still held their shape, contributing their own mild, slightly sweet flavor that complemented the savory filling without overwhelming it. Each person got their own pepper, which somehow made dinner feel more special than just scooping casserole onto plates. Kids felt important having their own individual meal, while adults appreciated the built-in portion control that helped stretch 1 pound of ground beef into enough dinner for 6 people. A little cheese on top during the last few minutes of baking created that golden, bubbly finish that made everything look intentional and appealing. The leftovers reheated beautifully, and any extra filling could be served over regular rice for anyone who didn't want to deal with the pepper itself. It was presentation and practicality working together, proving that sometimes the best way to make simple ingredients feel special was to serve them in a way that made everyone feel like they were getting their own personal meal. A beef stew with dumplings. When cheaper cuts of meat needed time to become tender and the weather outside made you crave something that would warm you from the inside out, beef stew was the answer that filled the house with promise long before dinner was actually ready. The sound of chuck roast sizzling in batches, followed by the gentle bubbling that would continue for hours, meant someone was taking the time to transform tough into tender through patience and low heat. This was slow cooking before anyone had heard of slow cookers, the kind of meal that simmered on the stovetop all afternoon while life happened around it. The browning step was crucial. You couldn't crowd the meat or it would steam instead of sear, and you needed that caramelization to build the deep, rich flavors that would carry the whole pot through hours of cooking. The vegetables went in at different stages depending on how long they took to cook. Onions early to develop sweetness and build the flavor base, potatoes and carrots later so they wouldn't fall apart from overcooking. The kitchen filled with the smell of slow simmering comfort, that deep, rich aroma that built anticipation for dinner while promising that something really good was developing in that pot. But the dumplings were what turned simple stew into something extraordinary. Basic biscuit dough dropped by spoonfuls into that simmering liquid, where they cooked up light and fluffy while absorbing all those rich flavors. The trick was not lifting the lid while they cooked. They needed steady steam to rise properly, and patience was the only ingredient that couldn't be substituted. By dinner time, those tough, cheap cuts had become fork tender, the vegetables had melted into a rich, thick broth, and those dumplings had transformed humble stew into something that felt like a feast. One pot fed the whole family, with enough left over for tomorrow's lunch, proving that the best comfort food came from understanding that time and technique could make anything delicious. Chicken and rice casserole. Layer raw rice in a casserole dish, place chicken pieces on top, pour cream of mushroom soup mixed with water over everything, cover with foil, and walk away. This was hands-off cooking at its finest, the kind of dinner that cooked itself while you dealt with everything else that needed attention after a long day. The gentle bubbling from the oven during that last hour promised that dinner was handling itself without any intervention required. The magic happened during that time in the covered dish. The rice absorbed all the flavors from the chicken and soup. The chicken cooked through perfectly without drying out, and everything melded together into something cohesive and satisfying. Unlike stovetop rice that could burn if you forgot to stir it, oven rice cooked evenly and consistently every time, making this one of those truly foolproof meals. The chicken pieces, usually thighs or drumsticks because they stayed moist during long cooking and cost less than breast, provided flavor and richness that enriched everything else in the dish. As they cooked, they released their juices into the rice below, creating something much more flavorful than plain rice and much more substantial than plain chicken soup. You could assemble it in the morning before work, refrigerate it all day, then slide it into the oven when you got home. By the time everyone had washed up and set the table, dinner was ready and waiting, hot and bubbling and smelling like someone had been cooking all day, even though you'd only been home for an hour. The variations were simple but effective. Add frozen vegetables for the last 20 minutes, sprinkle cheese on top after removing the foil, use different flavors of cream soup to change the whole personality of the dish. But the basic formula was bulletproof, perfect for busy families who needed reliable dinners that didn't require constant attention or complicated techniques. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Meatloaf was honest food that understood exactly what it was supposed to do, stretch expensive ground beef into something that could feed a family while still feeling substantial and satisfying. The mixing happened in a big bowl. Ground beef combined with breadcrumbs and beaten egg, diced onions for flavor and moisture, everything seasoned with salt and pepper and whatever else was handy. This wasn't about technique. This was about making something hearty that would stick to your ribs. Some families had their secret ingredients, a splash of Worcestershire sauce for depth, a packet of onion soup mix for convenience and flavor, milk soaked into the breadcrumbs to keep everything tender. But the real magic happened during that hour in the oven, when all those separate ingredients became something unified and the kitchen filled with the smell of honest cooking that promised satisfaction without pretense. The ketchup glaze was applied during the last 15 minutes, caramelizing into that shiny, sweet-tangy coating that made meatloaf look intentional rather than just like a loaf of seasoned ground meat. Some cooks mixed brown sugar into the ketchup for extra sweetness, others added a splash of vinegar for tang, but either way, that glaze was what transformed humble meatloaf into something that looked like it belonged on a proper dinner plate. The mashed potatoes were essential, fluffy, buttery platforms that could soak up any pan drippings while providing the carbohydrates that turned protein into a complete meal. Instant potatoes were perfectly acceptable because this wasn't about impressing anyone. This was about feeding families well without spending all day in the kitchen or all week's grocery money on fancy ingredients. Dads would slice it thick like a roast, serving it with the kind of pride that came from knowing this was honest food that satisfied working appetites. The leftovers were somehow even better. Cold meatloaf sandwiches on white bread with mayonnaise, proving that some meals actually improved overnight and gave you something to look forward to for lunch the next day. Chicken fried steak with gravy. Take cube steak that the butcher had already run through the tenderizer, coat it in seasoned flour, and fry it until golden and crispy. This was Southern comfort food that had found its way into working kitchens everywhere because it took the cheapest, toughest cut of beef you could buy and turned it into something that felt indulgent and satisfying. The sound of that breaded meat hitting hot oil promised something good was coming, even if it started with a cut that nobody would order at a restaurant. The flour coating served multiple purposes: protection during frying, creating that crispy exterior that would contrast with the tender meat inside, and providing the base for making gravy afterward. Smart cooks seasoned that flour with more than just salt and pepper, adding garlic powder, onion powder, maybe a little paprika for color and flavor that would make every bite taste intentional. The frying technique mattered more than the ingredients. Hot oil that sizzled immediately when the meat touched it, but not so hot that the coating burned before the meat cooked through. Cast iron skillets were perfect because they held heat evenly and created better browning than thin pans that couldn't maintain proper temperature. But the cream gravy made from those same drippings was what turned fried steak into something special. A few tablespoons of flour whisked into the hot fat, cooked just long enough to eliminate that raw flour taste, then milk added gradually while stirring constantly to prevent lumps. The result was rich, peppery gravy that was perfect for smothering that crispy steak and covering a mountain of mashed potatoes. Served with mashed potatoes and green beans or corn, it was a plate that looked like Sunday dinner but cost a fraction of what real steak would run. After a long day of physical work, coming home to chicken fried steak meant someone had taken the time to turn cheap into delicious, proving that the best comfort food came from understanding how to make something special from whatever you could afford. Bean and ham soup. The ham bone from Sunday dinner became Monday's foundation for something that would feed the family for days. Navy beans soaked overnight in cold water, then simmered with that meaty bone until everything was tender and the kitchen smelled like someone's grandmother was cooking. This was Depression-era wisdom that understood how to make expensive protein stretch across multiple meals, turning one ham into a week's worth of comfort. The ham bone was the secret that made this more than just bean soup. As it simmered, all that leftover meat fell off and distributed throughout the pot, while the bone itself released gelatin and smoky flavor that created a broth rich enough to satisfy the hungriest appetites. Even a bone that looked completely picked clean would give up amazing flavor during those long hours of gentle cooking. The beans needed that overnight soak to cook evenly, and they couldn't be hurried. Smart cooks learned not to add salt until the beans were completely tender because salt could prevent them from softening properly. As they cooked, they naturally thickened the broth, creating that hearty, stick-to-your-ribs consistency that made soup feel like a complete meal rather than just an appetizer. The best part was how it improved with time. Day 1, it was good soup that filled everyone up and provided comfort after a long day. Day 2, after all those flavors had time to get acquainted overnight, it was something special that tasted like it had been simmering for days. By day 3, it was so thick you could almost eat it with a fork, with a depth of flavor that rivaled anything from a fancy restaurant. Served with cornbread for soaking up that rich broth, this proved that you didn't need expensive ingredients to eat well, just patience, time, and the wisdom to use every part of what you had. A single ham bone could provide the foundation for multiple satisfying meals, making it one of the most economical ways to feed a family well. American goulash. This wasn't Hungarian goulash with paprika and wine. This was American goulash, born from the need to feed families with whatever was on hand and make it taste like something intentional. Elbow macaroni, ground beef, canned tomatoes, and whatever seasonings lived in your spice rack, all cooked together in one pot until the pasta was tender and the flavors had melded into something that tasted better than it had any right to. The beauty was in how adaptable it was to whatever ingredients were available or affordable. Bell peppers, if you had them, corn if the kids would eat it, onions for flavor foundation. But the core remained simple: pasta, meat, tomatoes, and enough seasoning to make it all taste purposeful. Some families called it slumgullion, others just called it dinner, but everyone understood what it was supposed to do. Everything cooked together in one pot, which meant the pasta absorbed all those savory flavors instead of just serving as a vehicle for sauce. The starch from the cooking pasta helped thicken everything naturally, creating something that held together on the plate rather than being soupy. You could taste each ingredient, but they all worked together to create something bigger than the sum of its parts. The key was getting the liquid ratios right so the pasta cooked properly without the dish becoming too dry or too wet. Most cooks learned through experience. Add just enough liquid to cover the pasta, let it simmer covered until tender, then adjust if needed. A sprinkle of cheese at the end could make it feel more indulgent, but it was perfectly satisfying on its own. This was the meal that happened when you needed to feed 6 people with what was left in the pantry, and somehow it always exceeded expectations. The leftovers were often better than the original, all those flavors having time to develop overnight into something that tasted like it had been planned all along rather than assembled from whatever was available. Pork chops and rice. Bone-in pork chops seared quickly to develop color, then laid over raw rice in a casserole dish with onion soup mix and chicken broth. Cover with foil and let the oven do the work while you dealt with homework and laundry and everything else that competed for attention after work. This was one-dish cooking that understood how to make cheaper cuts, taste expensive, and plain rice taste like something special. The browning step was crucial for building the flavors that would infuse everything else during that long, slow bake. You didn't need to cook the chops through, just enough color on both sides to create those caramelized bits that would dissolve into the rice and make every grain taste like it had been planning this flavor combination all along. The rice absorbed all those pork drippings and soup flavors while it cooked, becoming much more than just a side dish. By the time everything was tender, you had meat that fell off the bone and rice that was more flavorful than anything you could make on the stovetop. The foil cover was essential for trapping steam and ensuring even cooking without any attention from you. Pork chops were often on sale, making them an economical choice for families watching their budgets. The bone-in cuts had more flavor than the lean, boneless ones, and they stayed moist during the long cooking time that this dish required. Add some frozen vegetables during the last 20 minutes, and you had a complete meal that required almost no work once it went in the oven. The smell that filled the kitchen during that last hour was pure comfort, pork and rice and onion soup mix all melding together into something that promised satisfaction without complexity. One dish fed everyone, with minimal cleanup required, proving that the best weeknight meals were the ones that solved more problems than they created. Shepherd's pie, layer seasoned ground beef and vegetables in a casserole dish, top with mashed potatoes, and bake until golden brown around the edges. This was British comfort food adapted for American working families, using ingredients that were always available and turning them into something that looked impressive but was actually quite straightforward to prepare. The meat layer was where thrift and creativity came together. Ground beef stretched with whatever vegetables needed to be used up. Corn, peas, carrots, green beans, sometimes all of the above if the freezer needed cleaning out. A little Worcestershire sauce added depth. Some beef broth kept everything moist, and proper seasoning made it taste intentional rather than like leftovers you were trying to disguise. The mashed potato topping needed to be thick enough to hold up during baking, but creamy enough to complement the savory filling underneath. Many families used instant potatoes for convenience, and nobody complained as long as they were well seasoned with butter, milk, salt, and pepper. Some recipes called for beating an egg into the potatoes to help them brown better. The baking was what transformed separate components into something cohesive. As everything heated through, the flavors melded together while the potato topping developed that golden crust that provided textural contrast. Each serving revealed distinct layers that made simple ground beef feel sophisticated and intentional. This was dinner that looked like you'd put in serious effort, even when you'd mostly just assembled ingredients and let the oven do the work. It stretched 1 pound of meat into enough dinner for 6 people, with each serving substantial enough to leave everyone satisfied. Chicken and dumplings. When one chicken needed to feed 6 people and still feel like abundance rather than scarcity, chicken and dumplings was the answer that transformed shortage into plenty. The whole bird simmered until it fell apart, creating both the protein for dinner and the rich golden broth that would turn simple dumplings into something that felt like a feast. This represented the pinnacle of economical cooking, taking one ingredient and making it do the work of an entire meal. As the chicken cooked, it gave up its flavor to create a broth that was rich, gelatinous, and deeply satisfying. The vegetables added during cooking, onions, carrots, celery, provided aromatics that made the whole house smell like someone's grandmother was in charge of dinner. Once the chicken was tender enough to shred with a fork, the real magic began. Spoonfuls of dumpling dough dropped into that simmering broth, where they cooked up light and fluffy while absorbing all those rich flavors. The trick was patience. Lifting the lid to peak would let out the steam that the dumplings needed to rise properly. The finished dish was more than soup, but less than stew, with tender shredded chicken, perfectly cooked vegetables, and those fluffy dumplings all swimming in broth that tasted like comfort and satisfaction. It filled everyone up without feeling heavy, and somehow one chicken had become enough dinner for the whole family. The flavors actually improved overnight, making this one of those rare meals where leftovers were as good as the original. Reheating just required adding a little extra broth if the dumplings had absorbed too much liquid, proving that the best comfort food was the kind that kept giving even after the original meal was finished. Baked ziti. Cook ziti pasta until just tender, mix with ricotta cheese, tomato sauce, and Italian seasonings, top with mozzarella, and bake until bubbly. This was Italian-American comfort food that could be assembled in the morning, refrigerated all day, then baked when you got home from work. The kind of meal that made weeknight cooking feel manageable because most of the work happened hours before anyone was hungry. The ricotta cheese mixed throughout created pockets of creamy richness that contrasted with the tangy tomato sauce and the stretchy mozzarella on top. It was more interesting than plain spaghetti with sauce, but not so complicated that it intimidated inexperienced cooks. The pasta finished cooking in the oven, absorbing flavors while the top developed that perfect combination of crispy edges and melted cheese. Italian seasoning and garlic powder were essential for building flavors that made this taste authentically Italian-American. The sauce could be as simple as jarred marinara, perfectly acceptable and much more practical for busy families than making sauce from scratch. Some added cooked Italian sausage or ground beef for extra protein, but it was satisfying enough with just cheese and pasta. The key was slightly undercooking the pasta before assembly because it would continue cooking in the oven. Too tender at the start meant mushy pasta in the finished dish, but pasta that was still quite firm would achieve perfect texture after baking. The cheese needed to be distributed evenly, so every serving got some of that creamy richness. Leftovers were often preferred to the original meal because all those flavors had time to meld overnight. Reheating in the oven restored that perfect balance of crispy edges and creamy interior that made baked ziti irresistible, proving that some meals actually improved with time. Beef and bean burritos. Ground beef, seasoned with cumin and chili powder, mixed with refried beans, rolled in flour tortillas, and topped with cheese and sauce. This was Tex-Mex cooking adapted for family dinners, using ingredients that were becoming more widely available as American families discovered the appeal of bold flavors that made ordinary ingredients taste exotic and exciting. One batch of filling could make enough burritos for dinner, plus lunches for the rest of the week, making it an economical choice that stretched food dollars across multiple meals. The tortillas made everything portable and kid-friendly, while the beans added protein and fiber that made the meal more substantial than just meat and cheese wrapped in bread. Assembly line preparation turned this into a family activity where everyone could participate in rolling their own burritos and choosing their own toppings. Kids loved the hands-on nature of the meal, while parents appreciated how it accommodated different taste preferences within the same family. Mild for sensitive palates, spicy for those who wanted more heat. The seasoning was crucial for authentic tasting results. Cumin, chili powder, garlic powder, and onion powder transformed plain ground beef into something that tasted intentionally Mexican rather than just seasoned American. Packet mixes worked perfectly well for busy families who wanted consistent results without measuring multiple spices. The flexibility was endless. Chicken instead of beef, black beans instead of refried, different types of cheese for different flavor profiles. The toppings could be customized at the table, making this one meal that could satisfy multiple preferences simultaneously. Sour cream, salsa, lettuce, tomatoes. Everyone could build their perfect burrito from the same basic foundation. Corn dog casserole. Slice hot dogs into rounds, mix them with cornbread batter and canned corn, bake until golden brown on top. This was state fair food transformed into family dinner, combining all the flavors that made corn dogs irresistible while adapting them for home cooking without the hassle of deep frying or individual preparation. The genius was in capturing that sweet-salty combination that made corn dogs so appealing while making it practical for feeding a whole family. Hot dogs provided the salty, smoky protein that kids loved, while the cornbread batter contributed sweetness that balanced everything perfectly. The canned corn reinforced the corn flavor throughout the dish while adding texture and color. Kids loved it because it tasted like carnival food served on a regular Tuesday night. That combination of sweet cornbread and salty hot dogs hit all the same flavor notes that made fair food so irresistible, but served in a casserole dish that didn't require oil for frying or worry about individual items cooking evenly. Adults appreciated how it stretched expensive hot dogs into enough dinner for the whole family. A package of 8 hot dogs could easily feed 6 people when combined with cornbread batter, making it an economical choice for families watching their grocery budgets. The whole thing baked in one dish, which meant minimal cleanup after dinner. The leftovers were excellent cold or reheated, making great brown bag lunches or after-school snacks that kids would actually get excited about finding in their lunch boxes. It was comfort food that understood exactly what it was supposed to do, make everyone happy without requiring complicated techniques or expensive ingredients. Chicken tetrazzini. Named after an Italian opera singer, but pure American comfort food by the 1980s, chicken tetrazzini turned leftover chicken into something that felt elegant enough for company, but practical enough for family dinner. Spaghetti, mushrooms, and chicken bound together with a rich cream sauce, then topped with cheese and baked until golden and bubbling. This was another way to make yesterday's roast chicken feel like a completely different meal. The spaghetti was cooked until just tender because it would finish cooking in the oven and you didn't want it turning mushy during the baking process. The cream sauce was what made everything special, rich and velvety, flavored with chicken broth and sometimes a splash of sherry if you were feeling fancy. Mushrooms were traditional, adding earthy flavor and meaty texture that made the dish feel more substantial. Canned mushrooms worked fine for busy weeknights, though fresh ones that had been sautéed until golden provided better flavor and texture. The key was getting them well drained so they didn't make the finished dish watery. The cheese topping, usually Parmesan for sharp, nutty flavor, created that golden crust that made the casserole look finished and appealing. Some recipes also included Swiss or cheddar cheese mixed into the sauce for extra richness and better melting quality. The baking process brought everything together, creating something cohesive from what had started as separate ingredients. This was sophisticated comfort food that proved leftover chicken could become something special with just a little effort and the right supporting cast. It was fancy enough to serve to guests, but practical enough for family dinner, making it one of those reliable recipes that worked for multiple occasions. Swiss steak. Take round steak, pound it with a meat mallet until it was tender, coat it in seasoned flour, brown it in oil, then simmer it low and slow in tomato sauce until the meat gave up and became fork tender. This was how you made cheap, tough cuts taste like Sunday dinner, using time and technique to transform disappointment into satisfaction. Pounding was essential for breaking down tough muscle fibers that made round steak nearly inedible when cooked quickly, but treat it properly, with patience and moisture and gentle heat. And it could become incredibly tender and flavorful. The flour coating helped with browning and provided the base for thickening the braising liquid into something rich and satisfying. The braising liquid was usually tomato-based, providing acidity that helped break down tough connective tissue while adding flavor and color. Onions and bell peppers were traditional additions that provided sweetness and complexity, cooking down until they were soft and had given up their flavors to the sauce. The low, slow cooking couldn't be rushed. This was a dish that needed time for heat and moisture to work their magic on tough meat. Most recipes called for simmering, covered for at least an hour, sometimes 2, until the meat was so tender you could cut it with a fork. The kitchen filled with the smell of something good developing slowly. Served over mashed potatoes, rice, or egg noodles, it proved that you didn't need expensive cuts to create something satisfying and delicious. The rich, flavorful sauce was perfect for soaking up with whatever starch you chose, and the whole dish had that old-fashioned appeal that made everyone feel like they were being taken care of properly. King Ranch chicken. This Texas casserole layered chicken, cheese, bell peppers, onions, and tortillas in a creamy sauce made with cream of mushroom and cream of chicken soup. Named after the famous King Ranch, it was Tex-Mex comfort food that became popular as American families discovered they could add Southwestern flavors to familiar techniques without intimidating anyone. The dish was essentially Mexican-inspired chicken divan, using tortillas instead of rice, and adding cumin, chili powder, and peppers for flavors that felt exotic but not threatening. It was a way to incorporate the Tex-Mex tastes that were becoming increasingly popular while still using techniques and ingredients that didn't require special shopping trips or unfamiliar cooking methods. The layering was important for even distribution of flavors and textures. Chicken mixed with sautéed peppers and onions, torn corn tortillas, and plenty of shredded cheese, usually a combination of cheddar and Monterey Jack. The sauce bound everything together while adding richness that made this feel like special occasion food rather than just another weeknight casserole. Tortillas served the same function as pasta in other casseroles, providing starch that absorbed the flavorful sauce while adding authentic Mexican character to the dish. Corn tortillas were traditional for their flavor, but flour tortillas worked well too and were sometimes preferred for their milder taste and better absorption. The finished casserole was golden and bubbly, with melted cheese on top that promised comfort in every bite. It was sophisticated enough to serve to company, but practical enough for family dinner, proving that the best fusion food happened when familiar techniques met exciting new flavors. Breakfast for dinner. When regular dinner felt too complicated, but everyone still needed something substantial and satisfying, breakfast for dinner was the answer that broke all the rules and made everyone happy. Scrambled eggs with cheese, pancakes from a box mix, bacon or sausage if there was any left from the weekend, hash browns fried until crispy outside and tender inside. This was comfort food that worked on multiple levels. Kids loved it because pancakes for dinner felt like getting away with something special, like the rules had been suspended just for tonight. Adults appreciated it because breakfast foods were generally quick to prepare, used ingredients that were almost always on hand, and required minimal cleanup afterward. The beauty was in how it satisfied different needs simultaneously. Eggs provided protein that kept adults feeling full and satisfied, while pancakes delivered the carbohydrates and sweetness that made kids happy to clean their plates. Hash browns added the crispy texture that made everything feel more substantial than just a quick meal thrown together. Everything could be ready in 20 minutes, which made it perfect for those nights when time was short but appetites were big. The preparation was straightforward and forgiving. Eggs could be scrambled soft or firm, pancakes could come from a box mix without any shame, and hash browns cooked themselves with just occasional stirring. The psychological comfort was just as important as the physical satisfaction. There was something deeply soothing about eating breakfast foods when the day was winding down, like getting permission to be a little less formal, a little less worried about proper nutrition balance, and a little more focused on just making everyone feel cared for. Syrup on the eggs? Why not? Toast and jelly on the side? Absolutely. It was the great equalizer where everyone could find something they liked, and when dinner felt impossible, flipping pancakes at sundown made you feel like you were still taking care of your family, even when everything else felt chaotic. These 30 dinners were more than just recipes. They were the backbone of American family life in the 1980s, each one telling a story of making do, stretching dollars, and still managing to put love on the table every single night. They were meals born from necessity, but seasoned with care, proving that the best comfort food doesn't come from fancy ingredients, but from understanding exactly what people need when they sit down together at the end of a long, hard day. If you enjoyed this journey through the working man's dinners that built America's dinner tables, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the meals that shaped our memories and fed our families when it mattered most.